Have you ever done the right thing and wished you hadn't? Not because it was wrong, but because no one saw, or worse, because someone did and shamed you for it. In the quiet halls of a historic preservation office in Charleston, a shy intern named Eliza Moore spotted a simple mistake, a mix-up in two photo captions in a major proposal. One showed a lighthouse, the other a church. Both held meaning far beyond brick and mortar. She corrected them silently, carefully. Then the backlash came. Public embarrassment, accusations, silence where there should have been gratitude. If it were you, would you fix the mistake anyway, knowing it could cost you everything? This isn't a story about shouting to be heard. It's about whispering the truth and waiting to see if anyone listens. Step into the tender, stirring journey of a woman who dared to protect what mattered, even when no one else seemed to care. If this story touches something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to join us at Shining Stories, where every quiet voice has a place to be heard. Now, let's begin. What if the most pivotal moment in a $1 million decision came down to a quiet correction made by someone no one even noticed? It was 6:47 a.m. at Sage Heritage Hall, just a few blocks from Charleston Harbor. The streets were still glistening from an early rain, and the air held that distinct southern dampness that clung to skin like memory. Inside the historic brick building, silence reigned, the kind of silence only early risers and forgotten rooms know. Eliza Moore's sneakers squeaked faintly on the polished oak floor as she moved through the archival wing. She always arrived early, not out of ambition, really more out of habit, and maybe a little survival. In a world full of voices louder than hers, showing up first was her way of mattering. She clutched a leather-bound presentation folder to her chest, careful not to bend its edges. It contained the final proposal for a $3 million cultural preservation grant, a grant that could save several landmark sites across South Carolina, including the crumbling lighthouse off Sullivan's Island and the nearly abandoned Morris Street Baptist Church. She had been asked to simply organize and deliver the materials to the main conference room. Nothing more. But as she laid out the pages in precise rows, something caught her eye. Page 14, a photograph of the lighthouse, unmistakable, with its white spiral stripes, was labeled Morris Street Baptist Church. Below it, a caption praised the church's maritime significance. Confused, Eliza flipped forward. There, a grainy photo of the actual church was labeled Coastal Navigation Relic, with an entire paragraph crediting it for surviving Civil War naval bombardment. Her breath caught. Her fingers trembled. This wasn't just a typo. This was a credibility killer, a mistake so fundamental that anyone remotely familiar with Charleston's history would notice. If this went out under the Sage Heritage Hall name, it would unravel months of preparation and make them the laughingstock of the Preservation Foundation. Eliza froze. The folder seemed heavier now, as if loaded with consequence. She heard her own voice in her head, not the one that read out loud in meetings, but the one that whispered late at night. "You're not supposed to fix things. You're not qualified. You're just an intern." She stood still for a long time, the morning light crawling across the table, golden and indifferent. Her eyes flicked to the office door. Empty. Then a voice calm, dry, and seemingly from nowhere. Truth doesn't wait for permission. Eliza startled, dropping a page. From the far corner of the room, in an old leather reading chair she'd never seen anyone use, sat an older man with silver hair and quiet posture. A paper cup of tea steamed in his hand. He hadn't been there before. Or had he? I didn't realize anyone else was here, Eliza murmured. I often am, the man said, eyes gentle but searching, especially when the most important decisions are being made. She opened her mouth, then closed it. What could she say? That she was just someone with too much curiosity and too little authority. You saw the mistake, didn't you? The man asked, not accusing, just acknowledging. She nodded, slowly. Then the question becomes, he said, leaning slightly forward. Do you leave it because it's not your job, or correct it because it's right? Her throat tightened. I don't know. Well, the man smiled softly. I think you do. I think you knew before you even walked into this room. The only question is whether you believe your knowing matters. His words sat in the air like dust in a sunbeam light, but impossible to ignore. Eliza stood still for a moment longer. Then one step, then two. She returned to the conference table. Her fingers reached for the folder. She removed the mislabeled pages, opened her laptop, and began making quiet corrections. Every keystroke felt louder than it should have. She didn't sign her name. She didn't tell a soul. She reprinted the corrected pages and slipped them back into the folder, aligning the edges like nothing had happened. When she turned to thank the man, the chair was empty. Later that morning, the staff began to arrive rushed, talking over each other, coffee in hand, tension in their steps. The folder was collected and handed off to Clint Barker, the stern-faced project director whose name was etched into every draft of the proposal. He didn't glance at it. He just nodded sharply and disappeared into the boardroom. No one asked Eliza anything. No one knew what she'd done. But the air in the room shifted ever so slightly, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. And somewhere on the 12th floor of the grant evaluation office, that corrected page would become the one line a senior board member paused to admire, the single, subtle change that would steer an entire outcome. But Eliza wouldn't know that. Not yet. All she knew was that her hands had stopped shaking, and sometimes that's the only sign you need that you did the right thing. Before the folder, before the mistake, before the man in the chair, there was just Eliza. Most mornings, she rode her bike the long way to Sage Heritage Hall. It added 12 blocks and one extra bridge to her commute, but it gave her a few more minutes of quiet. She liked the way the water looked just after sunrise, how the ripples caught light like they were telling secrets. Eliza had lived in Charleston her whole life, but she never quite felt part of it. Not the Charleston of rooftop bars and heritage tours. Anyway, her Charleston was quieter, smaller, made of Sunday afternoons at her grandmother's house on Hanover Street, where the air always smelled faintly of lemon balm and old wood, and stories were currency. Her grandmother, June Moore, had been a public school librarian for over 30 years. She never made more than $38,000 a year, never got her picture in the paper. But to Eliza, she had been the keeper of everything that mattered of names, places, truths not written in textbooks. You listen close, Grandma June used to say, voice soft but firm. History's not just what's remembered, it's what's defended. Eliza did listen, always. She soaked in every word, every story, every brittle photograph. But listening had a cost. It made her see too much, feel too much. In high school, she tried once to speak up about a mislabeled civil rights mural in the history wing. She thought it would be a simple fix, but her teacher had dismissed her. The principal called it overstepping. Her classmates thought she was showing off. After that, Eliza learned to be quiet, to notice without comment, to care without being obvious. When she landed the internship at Sage Heritage Hall, it felt like a second chance, or at least a way to be close to what she loved without drawing attention. She was assigned to the archives team, mostly tasked with digitizing old records, updating indexes, and running occasional errands for the executive office. She liked it. The quiet hum of the dehumidifiers, the brittle feel of century-old paper between gloved fingers. No one expected her to speak much, and so she didn't. But that didn't mean she wasn't watching. She watched Clint Barker, the project director, bark orders like a general with a checklist. She watched the senior staff scurry around him, desperate for validation, for his rare but prized approval. She watched how interns like her were treated as temporary shadows, expected to keep their heads down and their coffee orders straight. And she watched the project unfold the massive grant proposal for the Charleston Preservation Initiative. It was to be the organization's biggest pitch in a decade. Clint had spent months shaping the narrative, selecting sites, curating images. Still, Eliza couldn't help but notice the flaws. Small ones, at first misdated events, misquoted speeches, things only someone who'd read as much local history as she had would catch. But it wasn't her place to correct them. That's what she told herself, over and over again, until she found the folder, until the lighthouse became a church, and the church became a joke. That morning, she'd biked in before the sun, her hair still damp from the shower, the cuff of her jeans tucked into her sock. She'd passed the same barista at the corner cafe who always waved but never remembered her name. And she'd entered Sage Heritage Hall, like she always did quietly, through the side entrance, with her ID badge still dangling from her neck. But something was different. Maybe it was the way the air felt heavier, or the fact that she hadn't slept well, or maybe it was the voice of Grandma June, echoing faintly in her memory. Silence isn't always golden, honey. Sometimes it's just comfortable cowardice. By the time Eliza found herself in that empty conference room, surrounded by the polished wood and velvet chairs reserved for board meetings, she already felt the weight of something she couldn't name. She didn't yet know that the man in the reading chair was Franklin Weller, the founder of the very foundation deciding the fate of the proposal. She didn't know he'd been coming in early, too, watching, observing, seeing what others missed. All she knew was that her hands shook, that her stomach churned, that something important was about to happen, and she would have to choose which part of herself to listen to the silent observer or the quiet rebel. And sometimes that decision starts long before you make it. The reading room had always been there, just off the east wing, a sun-warmed pocket tucked behind the donor archives, overlooked by almost everyone. The kind of room where time felt slower, like dust motes hung in the air out of reverence. Eliza hadn't planned to enter it that morning. She was carrying the revised proposal folder, her fingers still twitching from the decision she hadn't quite made yet. Her head spun with silent debates, and when she noticed the reading room door slightly ajar, she stepped inside, more out of habit than intention. A reflexive retreat. The space was quiet, wrapped in the hush of old books and aging leather. A single floor lamp glowed amber in the corner, casting soft shadows on the wood-paneled walls. It should have been empty, but it wasn't. He sat there, like part of the furniture, an older man, hair the color of chalk dust, reading something heavy-bound. A cup of tea steamed on the armrest, as if time bent just enough to serve him in peace. Eliza halted, instinctively clutching the folder closer. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't," he replied, not looking up. She stood there awkwardly, uncertain if she should leave or speak. He turned a page slowly, then glanced over his glasses. "That folder looks heavier than it should," he said. Eliza almost smiled. "It's important. Most things are," he said gently, "until you forget why." She blinked. That answer wasn't what she expected. There was a pause long enough to be uncomfortable, but not unkind. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit, if you want." She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself into the chair. The leather groaned softly beneath her. "I'm Eliza," she offered. "I know," he said. That stopped her cold. She tilted her head. "Have we met not properly?" he replied. "But I've seen you here. Early mornings. Always the first to arrive." Eliza flushed slightly. "Habit." "No," he said, studying her. "Not habit, intention." The room felt warmer suddenly, or maybe it was the heat rising in her cheeks. She looked down at the folder in her lap. "There's an error in here," she said finally. "A serious one, but it's not my job to fix it." The man didn't react, just waited. Eliza swallowed. "I'm not a curator. I'm not on the board. I'm just you," he interrupted softly. "Are someone who noticed, that already makes you rare." She stared at him. "Most people walk by mistakes every day," he continued. "They tell themselves it's not their concern, not their place." "You didn't." "I'm scared," she said, voice cracking. He nodded slowly. "Good. Fear means you're close to something that matters." Eliza looked away, her eyes landing on a framed photo near the window, a black and white image of the original Sage Heritage Hall in 1942, bricks half crumbling, workers standing in the dust. The building had once been a textile warehouse before it became a monument to memory. "I've worked here 3 months," she said quietly. "No one knows my name." "I do," he said. Something in his voice made her glance back. He was watching her now with a calm intensity, not judging, just seeing. "There's a line," he said, "between being invisible and choosing to remain unseen." "Which one are you?" "Eliza." She opened her mouth, closed it again. "I thought speaking up would feel empowering." She whispered, "But mostly it feels like I'm about to step off a cliff." "That's usually how you know it's worth doing," he said. There was a long pause. The old clock in the hall ticked faintly. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Finally." He leaned back slightly, tea cooling in his hand. "Because sometimes the smallest voices carry the clearest truths. But they need someone to say, 'I hear you.'" Eliza stared down at the folder again. Her thumb brushed over the edge of the page. She remembered the captions, the swapped labels, the backwards narrative, the careless treatment of places she'd grown up learning were sacred. Then she thought of her grandmother, the way she used to mark history books with sticky notes, labeled "not quite true" or "ask better questions." "I think I'm going to fix it," Eliza said softly. He nodded. "But I'm not going to sign my name." He nodded again, slowly this time. "Because I want the work to be right," she said. "Not about me." The man smiled. "That," he said, "is exactly why it should be." She stood, gripping the folder tighter now, more sure. As she reached the door, she turned back. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't catch your name." He paused for a breath, then answered Franklin. "Just Franklin." She nodded. "Thank you, Franklin." He raised his cup slightly, in a kind of toast, but as she stepped into the hallway, the silence followed her, not empty, but filled with something new. Resolve. The door clicked shut behind Eliza as she stepped out of the reading room. The hallway outside felt somehow brighter, though the lights hadn't changed. Maybe it was the way her chest rose and fell with more certainty now. Or maybe it was the sense that she just crossed an invisible line. She walked briskly, the folder pressed tight against her side, her mind buzzing like a summer cicada. Franklin's words echoed inside her like a soft drum beat. There's a line between being invisible and choosing to remain unseen. She stopped outside the small break room near the archives, empty, just as she expected. With hands that still trembled slightly, she placed the folder down on the table, opened it, and stared once more at the mislabeled photographs. It still felt wrong. The lighthouse called a church, the church mistaken for a relic. These weren't just harmless errors, they were careless misrepresentations of history, of memory, of people. Her fingers moved before her thoughts could catch up. She opened her laptop, slid into one of the stiff plastic chairs, and began to retype the captions. Each correction felt like a quiet rebellion. She rechecked the coordinates, reworded the contextual notes, and adjusted the dates with the care of someone brushing dust off a fragile artifact. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic music, just the soft sound of keys tapping in a mostly forgotten room. At one point, she paused, cursor blinking, uncertainty creeping in. What if I make a mistake? What if they find out? What if this makes things worse? But then came another voice, gentler, older. Truth doesn't wait for permission. She exhaled and kept typing. By the time she finished, the sun had risen high enough to cast slanted lines of gold across the linoleum floor. The office had begun to stir muffled voices, coffee brewing, the copier spitting out its first batch of the day. Eliza printed the new pages on the thick, cream-colored paper reserved for official submissions. She aligned them carefully with the originals, removed the incorrect ones, and slid the corrected pages into the folder with the precision of someone placing tiles in a mosaic. She didn't sign her name. She didn't leave a note. She simply closed the folder, straightened the stack, and returned it to the tray marked Final Copy, Boardroom Delivery, and then she walked away. Her steps were slow at first, unsure, but as she turned the corner back toward the archive wing, something inside her shifted, a quiet clarity, like dust settling after a long breath. She didn't know what would happen next, whether anyone would notice, whether it would cause a storm or pass like a breeze. But in that moment, none of it mattered. She knew she had done the right thing, and sometimes that knowing that quiet, unshakable truth was enough. The rest of the morning passed in its usual rhythm. Clint Barker arrived just before 9, flanked by 2 assistants and a cell phone pressed to his ear. He glanced at the folder briefly before sweeping it into his leather satchel. He didn't comment on the pages. He didn't notice the absence of a signature. No one did. Eliza kept to her routine cataloging a new batch of letters from the 1890s, updating a spreadsheet on preservation permits, answering emails that didn't require emotion or thought. But beneath it all, her heart thudded in a slow, steady beat. By lunchtime, the boardroom doors had closed. Clint and the senior staff were inside, presenting the proposal to the Foundation's Advance Review Committee via video call. It was the first of 2 presentations, a pre-screen, before the final pitch next week. Eliza stayed in the archive room, headphones in, but no music playing. Her thoughts raced too loudly for distractions. No one had come running, no alarms, no raised voices. Maybe they'd accepted the new version without a second glance. Maybe that was enough. Or maybe the real consequence hadn't come yet. At 2:17 p.m., she received a brief Slack message from the project coordinator. "Thanks for organizing the board materials this morning." Smooth delivery. That was it. Just 3 lines. No clue about whether the changes had made it through. No sign of approval or disapproval. Still, Eliza found herself smiling. Just a little. She hadn't asked for thanks. She hadn't asked for anything. She'd simply done what needed to be done. That night, she stayed late, not because she had to, just because the building felt different now, as if the walls themselves had absorbed her choice and were quietly holding space for it. As she packed up, she passed the reading room again. It was empty this time. No tea, no Franklin. Just the memory of a quiet voice reminding her that being right didn't require permission, just courage. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, the kind of Charleston morning where even the Spanish moss hung low, as if the sky itself couldn't summon the will to shine. Eliza came in early, as usual. She always did, but this time her steps were slower, more cautious. She paused at the front entrance of Sage Heritage Hall, watching her own reflection in the tall glass doors. The girl staring back at her looked the same pale, freckled skin, eyes a little too big, hair pinned up in a no-nonsense twist, but inside, everything had shifted. The correction was made. The truth was quietly placed where it belonged. She thought that would be the hardest part. She was wrong. By mid-morning, a strange tension rippled through the building. Conversations grew hushed. People whispered more than they spoke. The atmosphere felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. At 10:02 a.m., Clint Barker summoned the full staff to the conference room. No agenda, no prior notice. Eliza's stomach turned. She slipped into the back of the room, her notebook clutched against her chest like armor. The room was packed. Project managers, coordinators, interns, even 2 members of the maintenance crew. Clint stood at the front, his usual forced charisma replaced by something tighter, sharper. In his hand, he held a copy of the grant proposal, the one Eliza had corrected. He laid it flat on the table like evidence in a courtroom. "We are facing a very serious breach of protocol," Clint began, voice calm but cold. "Someone within this office took it upon themselves to alter our final grant submission materials without approval." A ripple of confusion spread across the room. Heads turned, brows furrowed. Clint lifted a page, holding it up. "This version, the one sent to the board yesterday, is not the version we authorized. It contains unsanctioned edits to key sections, including our historical attributions. This is not a minor error. This is a violation of chain of command, of trust, and of professional standards." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I want the person responsible to come forward. Now." No one moved. Not a whisper. Not a breath. Eliza felt her pulse slam against her ribs. Her ears buzzed. She could hear nothing but her own fear. Clint's gaze swept the room, scanning for guilt, and then it landed on her. "Eliza," he said, voice smoother now, "you were here early that morning, weren't you?" Every head turned. Her throat tightened. The walls felt like they were pressing in. Yes," she said, barely a whisper. "And you handled the folder. Correct." She nodded, slowly. He stepped forward. "Did you notice anything unusual? Anyone else with access to the materials?" The room waited. She had a choice. She could lie, stay silent, let the moment pass, or she could stand in the truth, even if it cost her everything. "I made the changes," she said, voice barely audible. The silence that followed was total. Clint's eyes narrowed. "You." She nodded. "You're an intern." He snapped. "You have no authority, no credentials, no permission to touch official documentation." "I know," she said softly, "but the captions were wrong. The dates were reversed. The locations were mislabeled. It wasn't your job to know." He cut in. "It was your job to file papers and stay out of the way." The words hit harder than she expected, and not because they were new, but because they were old, familiar, like every time she'd been dismissed, ignored, overlooked. "I didn't want credit," she said, trying to steady her voice. "I just wanted it to be right." Clint's jaw clenched. "This is not about being right. This is about following procedure." Behind him, one of the senior researchers, Marianne, shifted uncomfortably, but she said nothing. No one did. "You could have jeopardized the entire proposal." Clint continued. "Do you understand that?" Eliza nodded, though her eyes burned. "I'm sorry," she said, because it was all she had left. Clint turned away. "From now on, you're removed from all project materials. You'll continue clerical duties only. No involvement in proposal development. Is that clear?" She said nothing. The meeting ended in silence. People filed out slowly, glancing at her with a mix of sympathy and discomfort, but no one said a word. She remained at the back of the room, notebook still in hand, tears pooling quietly behind her eyes. She had done the right thing, but in this place that seemed to matter the least. The archive room was always the quietest part of Sage Heritage Hall. Tucked behind the main exhibit space, it was a sanctuary of aging boxes, faded labels, and silent history. But that afternoon, it held something else, the ache of a bruised spirit. Eliza sat on the floor between two towering shelves, her back against a crate marked Charleston Flood Relief, 1929. Her notebook lay open beside her, untouched. Her fingers traced circles into the carpet as if she could erase what had happened. She hadn't cried. Not really. Just a few stinging tears that dried before they could fall. She had done everything right, not for glory, not for attention, but because it mattered, because facts mattered, places mattered, history mattered. But to Clint, it hadn't been about truth. It had been about control. And now she sat, reduced again to just the intern, to silence. She didn't hear the footsteps at first, soft, unhurried, familiar. A shadow stretched across the floor beside her, and a warm, gentle voice followed. I brought chamomile, good for frayed nerves and tired eyes. Eliza looked up. There stood Margaret Alden, the head archivist, a woman in her 70s, with silver hair pulled into a loose bun, cardigan sleeves pushed up to her elbows, and a gaze that could read more than just old documents. Margaret lowered herself beside Eliza without asking permission, placing two mismatched teacups on the floor between them. She handed one over and waited quietly, letting the silence settle. Eliza took the cup with both hands, the heat spreading slowly into her palms. "Rough day," Margaret said softly. Eliza didn't answer right away. "I thought doing the right thing would feel better," she finally said. Margaret nodded. "Sometimes it does. Sometimes it just feels lonely." They sipped in silence. After a moment, Eliza said, "He didn't even ask why I did it. Just shut me down, like my voice never mattered. Because to him," Margaret said gently, "your voice wasn't part of the plan." Eliza stared into her tea. "I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I just couldn't let the mistake go, not with everything at stake." "I know," Margaret said. "I know because I've been you." Eliza glanced at her, surprised. Margaret smiled faintly, eyes distant. "When I first started here, decades ago, I found dozens of records misfiled. Nothing dramatic, just wrong. Black families listed under miscellaneous. Women's names missing from donor logs. Stories that deserved more than dust and silence." "What did you do?" Eliza asked. "I fixed them," Margaret said quietly, "one by one, and when someone finally noticed, they called it overstepping. Told me I wasn't qualified to make editorial decisions, that I should leave the real history to the historians." Eliza's throat tightened. "Did it stop you?" "Only for a little while," Margaret said. "But the thing is, one of those corrections helped a student find her great-grandmother's name on a donor wall. That student grew up to be a preservation lawyer. She's the one who fought to save the Liberty Street Bridge from demolition last year." Eliza blinked. That was her. Margaret nodded. "Sometimes the impact of what you fix doesn't show up until long after you forget you even fixed it." They sat quietly, sipping, the warm taste of tea grounding them both. "Still," Eliza said softly, "I feel stupid. I knew what would happen. I still did it. Were the facts correct?" "Yes." "Then you weren't wrong," Margaret said firmly. "You were just early. And sometimes being early feels a lot like being alone." Eliza looked away, swallowing the lump in her throat. Margaret's voice softened even further. "I had a daughter once. Her name was Lillian. She'd be about your age now." Eliza turned sharply, surprised by the tremor in the older woman's voice. "She died in a car accident when she was 17. Margaret continued, bright, passionate, full of too many ideas and not enough patience. "She used to say, 'If it's broken, why would I wait to fix it?' I see her in you, Eliza." Tears welled again, but this time Eliza didn't blink them away. She would have been proud, Margaret whispered. They sat in silence, letting the moment hold. Outside, the wind rustled the magnolia trees. Inside, something unspoken passed between them, a quiet exchange of pain, recognition, and hope. Finally, Margaret stood, brushing off her skirt. "Don't let anyone convince you your voice doesn't matter," she said. "Some of us have been waiting our whole lives to hear it." Eliza nodded, words caught behind gratitude. As Margaret walked away, her teacup left behind like a blessing. Eliza reached for her notebook. This time she opened it and wrote, not because anyone asked, but because the story deserved to be remembered. Monday arrived with the scent of honeysuckle drifting in through the old windows at Sage Heritage Hall. The early light filtered through lace curtains, laying soft patterns on the floor like whispers waiting to be heard. Eliza arrived just before 7 as always, but something was different. She didn't walk quite as quickly. She paused before the archive door, hand resting gently on the worn brass knob. She was still carrying the weight of last week's shame, the quiet fury of being scolded for caring too much. But Margaret's words had carved a new space inside her, a space where she no longer apologized for being the kind of person who noticed. By 9:15, the usual bustle had returned, the clicking of heels, the low hum of printers, the voices of staff rehashing the weekend over burnt coffee. At 10:03 a.m., Clarissa Green, the office administrator, with a soft spot for sugar cookies and antique pens, appeared in the main hallway, waving a thick envelope. "It's here," she said, voice barely contained. Everyone turned. Clarissa held up the envelope like it was made of gold leaf. It was cream-colored, sealed in deep green wax with the emblem of the Charleston Cultural Preservation Board, the kind of envelope that only arrived for the most consequential projects. "The response to our preliminary submission," she added. Eyes wide, Clint Barker emerged from his office. "All business. Let's bring everyone in," he said, straightening his tie. The envelope was placed on the conference table like a crown. The room filled quickly, project managers, research assistants, marketing staff. Even Margaret took a seat in the back, her cup of tea balanced on her lap. Eliza hovered near the door, notebook in hand, unnoticed. Clint broke the seal. Silence fell as he unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning quickly. Then he paused, his brows lifted. He cleared his throat. "Dear Sage Heritage Hall," he read, voice steady. "We are pleased to inform you that your preliminary grant proposal has passed the first stage of evaluation. Your attention to cultural accuracy and historical specificity stood out to our review board." A quiet buzz moved through the room. Clint continued, but Eliza barely heard the rest. In particular, the corrected attribution of the Charleston Lighthouse and Morris Street Baptist Church was praised for its clarity and care. Her ears rang. She looked up. No one else reacted, not the way she expected. Just polite nods, a few smiles, the occasional whispered good job between staff. They didn't know. They didn't realize that the one change they were being praised for had nearly gotten her demoted. They didn't know she had been told her voice didn't matter. And now, that very voice, quiet, trembling, uncredited, had made the difference. She felt her hands start to shake, just a little. Not with fear this time. but with something that felt like release. Clarissa grinned. "This means we're presenting next Friday at the Heritage Conference Center." Clint nodded, trying to mask his surprise. "We'll move forward with final revisions. Let's ensure all materials are flawless." As the staff broke into low celebration, Eliza turned quietly to leave the room. No one stopped her. She didn't need them to. In the hallway, Margaret caught up with her. "You heard?" she asked softly. Eliza nodded. "They don't know." "Maybe not," Margaret said. "But you do?" Eliza looked down. "It's strange. I thought I'd want them to say it, out loud. But I don't. Not really." Margaret smiled. "Because it was never about being right. It was about being true." They walked side by side, silent for a moment. Then Eliza said, almost to herself, "The truth found its way. It always does." Margaret said. They passed Franklin Weller near the exhibit stairwell. He was reading again, always reading. As they walked by, he looked up and met Eliza's eyes. He said nothing, just nodded, the faintest glint in his gaze. And Eliza understood. He knew. He had always known. That afternoon, as the others prepared presentation materials and printed new copies of the now praised document, Eliza returned to her small desk in the archive wing. She placed the letter, a scanned copy Clarissa had forwarded, into the digital archive under Proposal A27. She tagged it with a quiet note. See page 14, revised attribution. And when the file closed, she smiled. Sometimes a single change in a forgotten hallway reshapes everything in a conference room. And sometimes no one needs to know who made it happen except the person who did. Friday morning arrived wrapped in mist. Charleston streets shimmered with dew, and the air smelled of river salt and jasmine. At Sage Heritage Hall, the building buzzed like a hive. Papers rustled, slides clicked, voices practiced scripts under their breath. It was the day of the big presentation. The final pitch to the Cultural Preservation Board. Eliza had come in early again, but this time not to correct anything, just to help where she could. She carried 2 heavy boxes of backup materials, labeled binders, power cords, extra programs down to the service entrance of the Charleston Heritage Conference Center. As she approached the back hallway, her eyes caught something strange, a sleek black car pulling up to the private entrance. Polished, reserved, the kind of car that said someone important is inside. The rear door opened, and out stepped Franklin Weller. But this wasn't the man from the reading room. This was someone else entirely. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His silver hair, once tousled and gentle, was now neatly parted. He walked not like a quiet observer, but like someone used to being watched. He was flanked by 2 assistants, one carrying a briefcase, the other speaking into a headset, listing names and times. Eliza froze. The box slipped from her arms, papers scattering across the damp pavement. Franklin turned at the sound. Their eyes met. Time stilled. One of the assistants moved to help, but Franklin raised a hand, walked over, and crouched beside Eliza without a word. She knelt, gathering pages with trembling fingers. "You," she whispered. "You're—" He smiled softly. "Franklin Weller," he said, chairman of the Cultural Preservation Board, founder of the Weller Foundation, co-founder of Sage Heritage Hall. She stared, her voice caught behind disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me?" she breathed. "Because if you knew," he said, picking up the last page, you would have treated me differently. And I needed to see who you were when you thought no one important was watching." Eliza stood slowly, clutching the papers to her chest. "You've been evaluating me. I've been listening," he corrected gently. "Getting to know you." Her voice wavered. Why, Franklin looked past her for a moment, toward the conference center's tall glass doors, where banners flapped in the breeze. "Because 30 years ago, I made a promise to someone I loved, a promise to protect the stories that get buried. And that means protecting the people who tell them, too, even the quiet ones." He turned back to her, his eyes soft but steady. "And today," he said, "we need someone who knows the truth about this proposal, not just the facts, but the heart behind it. Someone who cares more about accuracy than applause." Eliza blinked. "You want me to speak? I want you to help." He said, "Clarissa has the facts, but I think you have the story." She stepped back, shaking her head. "I can't. I'm not qualified." He asked. She nodded. He smiled gently. "Eliza, you corrected the most critical error in this proposal. You did it quietly. You did it well, and you did it because it was right, not because it was easy. That is exactly the kind of voice we need in that room." She swallowed. Her hands were shaking. "I'm not a historian. No," he said. "You're something rarer. You're someone who sees what others miss and has the courage to speak, even when no one asks." The doors to the conference center opened, and a staff member called out, "Mr. Weller, the board is ready for you." He turned to Eliza one last time. "This is your moment," he said, "but only if you want it." And then he walked inside, leaving her standing in the morning light with her decision in her hands. Inside the conference center, rows of polished chairs filled the main hall. A large screen displayed the Sage Heritage Hall logo. Board members from across the state took their seats, their expressions unreadable. Clarissa stood backstage, flipping through note cards, her face pale. "I don't think I can do this," she said, her voice hoarse. Franklin placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do it alone." Clarissa looked confused, and then Eliza appeared, box in hand, voice steady. "I'll present with you," she said. Clarissa blinked. "You sure?" Eliza nodded. And, for the first time in days, she felt her fear ease, not disappear, but transform, from a weight to a reason. The lights above the Charleston Heritage Conference Center stage were sharp and unforgiving. From the wings, Eliza watched rows of board members settle into their seat suits, pens, notepads, expressions unreadable, a sea of judgment and possibility. Clarissa Green stood just beside her, eyes wide, her usual calm rattled, her voice, still scratchy from nerves, cracked as she whispered, "I can't do it. Eliza, I know the data, but I can't feel it anymore." Eliza nodded, her pulse quickening, and then she stepped forward, not because she felt brave, but because she knew it was needed. Her footsteps echoed faintly across the polished stage floor. She reached the podium, hands tight around the edges. For a moment, she couldn't see past the lights, just shadows, shapes, and the memory of Franklin's voice in the hallway. "You're someone who sees what others miss and has the courage to speak, even when no one asks." She took a deep breath and began. "My name is Eliza Moore," she said, voice small but clear. "I'm not part of the senior staff. I wasn't supposed to speak today. A few heads tilted. I'm here because a few weeks ago I noticed a mistake, a small one, in the middle of a very important document, the kind of mistake that's easy to miss unless the story means something to you. She clicked the remote. The first slide appeared a photograph of the Charleston Lighthouse. This is the lighthouse on Sullivan's Island, she continued. My great-aunt used to take me there as a child. She told me stories about how it guided sailors home, even during the war. She said history doesn't always shout. Sometimes it flickers like light. Another click. The next slide, Morris Street Baptist Church. And this, she said, is where my grandmother was baptized. It stood through hurricanes, fire, and silence. And in our proposal, these two places so different, so full of meaning, were swapped, their stories nearly erased. The room was silent. I wasn't supposed to fix it, but I did. She paused, scanning the faces, because sometimes doing the right thing doesn't wait for a title or permission. It just waits for someone to care. She looked directly at the board chair now, her voice steadying. We ask you to fund this project because Charleston's history isn't just buildings and dates. It's people, memories, lighthouses, and churches that meant everything to someone. And if we don't protect them with care, with precision, we risk forgetting who we really are. The final slide appeared a photo of both landmarks side by side. A caption read, "What we remember shapes what we preserve." Eliza stepped back from the podium. No fanfare, no applause, just silence. And then slowly a single clap from the front row. Franklin Weller. It spread, soft and steady, like rain before a storm. The room rose to its feet, not for a dazzling speech, but for a quiet truth, spoken out loud. Eliza felt the tightness in her chest begin to ease. Her hands still shook, but not from fear anymore. From relief, from the quiet knowledge that her voice had made its way through. Not because it was loud, but because it was honest. Backstage, Clarissa hugged her tightly. "You saved us," she whispered. Eliza smiled faintly. "No, I just remembered what mattered." And in the corner, Franklin watched, silent and proud, as the girl who once doubted her voice now used it to light the way. The applause didn't fade quickly. It lingered soft, respectful, almost reverent, as if the room itself needed time to breathe again. Eliza stepped off the stage, not to thunderous cheers, but to something deeper silence filled with meaning. The kind of silence people hold when they've just remembered something important. Clarissa was waiting in the wings, tears shining in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered. Eliza shook her head gently. "We did." Franklin Weller was already rising from his seat, his expression unreadable, but his eyes glowing with quiet pride. Around him, board members stood, some still clapping, others just watching her with expressions that felt less like judgment and more like recognition. It wasn't about the slides. It was never about the slides. It was about what people remembered when they saw them. After the presentation, there was a short break before the final board deliberations. Eliza walked the halls of the conference center alone, the tension easing from her shoulders bit by bit. In one of the exhibit wings, a temporary display had been set up photographs of Charleston's endangered historic sites, framed letters from preservation campaigns, diary excerpts from soldiers, teachers, mothers. She paused in front of a handwritten letter, faded ink on yellowed paper. April 13th, 1861. We stood at the edge of the fort today. I could see the smoke rising over the harbor. I don't know what this war will take, but I pray we remember who we are when it's done. Private Samuel Moore. Her breath caught. That was her ancestor. She knew the handwriting. Her grandmother had shown her this letter once, years ago, in a wooden box lined with silk. She reached out, fingertips brushing the glass gently. The past didn't feel so far away. Eliza. She turned. An older woman stood nearby, modest dress, gray cardigan, small pin on her lapel, shaped like a magnolia blossom. I just wanted to say thank you, the woman said softly. What you said, it reminded me of my father. Eliza tilted her head. Listening? He was a bricklayer, the woman continued. Helped rebuild Morris Street Baptist after the hurricane in '59. Never talked much about it. But he used to say, that church stood because someone had to believe it was worth the trouble. She smiled, voice thickening. And when you spoke about it today, you made me remember not just the place, but him. Eliza's eyes welled again. She nodded, unable to find the words. Another voice chimed in, nearby a man in his 60s, holding a program with the Heritage Hall logo. My grandfather used to tend the lighthouse, he said, approaching slowly. He was just 17 when he started. Walked 2 miles every day at sunrise to keep the lens clean. He chuckled, said that light was the only thing that ever told the truth in a storm. Soon, Moore joined them. A quiet circle formed strangers, connected not by name, but by memory, not facts, but feeling. One woman shared how she met her husband on the church steps during a voter registration drive in 1965. A man recalled sneaking into the lighthouse during high tide as a teenager, just to feel like he belonged to something older than himself. And Eliza stood at the center of it, not leading, not commanding, just being there. The still point where all their stories converged. Across the hallway, Franklin Weller watched quietly. He didn't interrupt, didn't need to. He'd seen it before this moment, when history stops being something behind glass and starts being something alive, breathing, remembered. When the crowd began to disperse, Franklin stepped forward. Did you hear them? He asked Eliza gently. She nodded. I didn't know it would feel like this. He smiled. Stories don't belong in boxes, Eliza. They belong in people. And today, you gave them back to the ones who needed them most. She looked down, then back at the glass case with her ancestor's letter. I think he would have liked that, she said. Franklin's voice softened. I think he would have been proud. Back in the main hall, the board reconvened. Eliza returned to her seat beside Clarissa, heart still full, mind spinning with the weight and wonder of the morning. They waited quietly, not for approval, but for closure. Whatever happened next, something had already changed. Not just the vote, but the story. Because someone had remembered, and when people remember, they begin to care. The letter arrived 3 days later, not by email, not through internal memos or Slack threads, but in a thick, cream-colored envelope, the same wax seal, the same careful penmanship delivered by hand to the front desk at Sage Heritage Hall. Clarissa was the first to spot it. She carried it like something sacred. A smile blooming slowly across her face as she passed by Margaret in the archive hallway, nodding without a word. Eliza looked up from her desk just in time to see Clarissa slip into Clint Barker's office, envelope in hand. 15 minutes later, the entire team was summoned. Eliza entered the conference room last, uncertain if she should even be there. She hovered near the door until Franklin Weller, already seated, turned slightly in his chair and gave her the smallest, most certain nod. So she stayed. Clint stood at the front, the open letter on the table beside him. For once, his voice wasn't inflated with performance. "There are moments in an organization's life," he said slowly, "when something shifts, when we move from what we were into what we're meant to become." He glanced around the room. This is one of those moments. He picked up the letter and read aloud. Dear Sage Heritage Hall, the Board of the Charleston Cultural Preservation Trust is honored to award your team the full grant request of $3 million to support your work in restoring and preserving the Morris Street Baptist Church and the Charleston Lighthouse. Your submission demonstrated a deep respect for accuracy, historical integrity, and community memory. In particular, the attention given to site distinctions and narrative context set your proposal apart. We commend your team's commitment to both scholarship and heart. The room broke into applause, louder than anything Eliza had heard in those walls before. Clarissa clapped with both hands, and a laugh of pure joy. Margaret reached over to squeeze Eliza's hand. Franklin smiled but said nothing, his eyes fixed on the woman near the back who'd said the least and done the most. And then, to everyone's surprise, Clint turned to face Eliza. "I want to say something," he said, his voice careful. To Eliza. The room quieted. Clint took a breath. "I was wrong," he said plainly. "I dismissed your voice. I valued process over purpose. I assumed that authority was the same as wisdom, and I forgot that courage often comes without permission." Eliza blinked, stunned. "I owe you more than an apology," Clint continued. "I owe you recognition. You saw something we missed, and you acted not to prove a point, but to protect the truth." He stepped forward. "I would be honored," he said, "if you'd help lead the next phase of this project. As an equal." The room held its breath. Eliza felt her throat tighten. She wasn't sure she could speak, but she didn't need to. She just nodded, slow and certain, and that was enough. Later that evening, when most of the staff had gone home, the building felt different, lighter, more alive. Margaret lit a candle in the archive office, her quiet ritual after long days, while Clarissa appeared with a tray of ginger cookies and chamomile tea. Franklin took his usual place in the reading chair by the window. Eliza stood near the map wall, the one marked with pins of every saved site. She added 2 more, one for the church, one for the lighthouse. Then she joined them, to quiet voices. Margaret toasted, "That speak the loudest truths, to second chances," Clarissa added, "and the people who make them count." Franklin raised his cup last, to stories not the kind we write in reports, but the kind we carry in our bones. Eliza smiled, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a guest in the room. She felt like she belonged. A month had passed since the grant was awarded. Spring had fully arrived in Charleston, magnolia trees in bloom, river light dappling the cobblestones, and soft winds carrying the scent of sea salt through open windows. At Sage Heritage Hall, the rhythm of work moved forward grant timelines, outreach plans, restoration prep. But beneath all of it was something quieter, something steadier, trust and presence. Eliza no longer came in before sunrise just to go unnoticed. She still came early, but now it was to unlock the doors, to set up the archive room, to welcome volunteers and student interns who'd started arriving in waves. On one such morning, a knock echoed against the reading room door. She opened it. A girl stood there, maybe 19, maybe younger, with a backpack slung over one shoulder and uncertainty in her eyes. "Hi," she said softly. "I'm here for the intern tour, but I think I'm lost." Eliza smiled. "You're not lost," she said gently. "You're just early." The girl laughed nervously. "Is that okay?" Eliza stepped aside, holding the door open. "It's more than okay," she said. "Come in." They sat in the same chairs where Eliza once met Franklin, the same window light, the same warmth in the air. The girl introduced herself as Nora, a first-year college student studying public history. She had freckles like Eliza's, a quiet voice, and a nervous energy that spoke of someone unsure if she belonged. Eliza listened as she talked about growing up in a small town, how her grandmother used to take her to graveyards and tell her stories of people buried there, how she wanted to preserve those memories before they disappeared. Eliza nodded often. She understood. Sometimes, Nora said, I feel like I care about the wrong things. Like too much. Eliza smiled, her heart tightening with recognition. I used to think that too, she said, until someone reminded me that caring is never wrong, especially when no one else does. Nora looked down at her hands, then back up. I want to help, she whispered, but I don't know where to start. Eliza reached over and handed her a small folder, the same kind she once used to quietly fix a mistake no one else saw. Start with this, she said, and remember, you don't need a title to protect the truth. You just need to notice. Later that afternoon, Eliza stood at the map wall again, the one now peppered with new pins, new projects, new stories. Franklin joined her, his cane tapping gently against the hardwood floor. She reminds me of you, he said, nodding toward the intern office where Nora had begun cataloging her first archive box. Eliza smiled. She's already noticing things we've missed. Franklin chuckled. Good. He leaned in, voice quieter now. You did more than fix a proposal, Eliza. You created space for voices, for memory, for legacy. She looked at him. I just told the truth, and that, he said, is how history gets written. In the weeks that followed, more visitors came, descendants, donors, students, community elders. Some brought letters, others brought photographs. One woman brought a single brick from a church wall her father helped build. Each one shared a story. And each time, Eliza listened not as a gatekeeper, not as a figure of authority, but as someone who understood the sacred act of remembering. One afternoon, Margaret entered with a new display board. She placed it near the front lobby, right under the inscription, Preserve with Purpose. The board read unsung, historians, the quiet ones who remember a tribute to those who listen when no one speaks, who notice what others miss, and who carry truth forward with care. There were no names listed, but Eliza knew. It was about people like her, and people like Nora, and all the others who came before the bricklayers, the note writers, the grandmothers, and lighthouse keepers. On her way out one evening, Eliza paused by the front desk. The sun had dipped low, casting golden light through the wide glass doors. She watched as Nora helped an elderly man label a photo. Clarissa was writing thank you notes. Margaret was sipping tea. And somewhere in the building, Franklin's cane echoed faintly against the floorboards, a circle, still turning, still whole, still continuing. Eliza smiled and stepped into the evening light. In the quiet corners of life, the bravest choices are often the smallest. Eliza didn't shout. She didn't argue. She simply did what was right, even when no one asked, even when it nearly cost her everything. And through her quiet courage, something remarkable happened. Truth was honored and hearts were stirred. This story reminds us that integrity doesn't need applause to matter, that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that tremble, and that no act of kindness, no gesture of care, no matter how small, is ever wasted. For those of us who have lived long enough to see how fragile truth can be, Eliza's journey brings both comfort and conviction. It tells us we are never too old or too invisible to make a difference, that even in silence, we still shape the world. So, wherever you are, however quiet your life may feel, remember someone out there is waiting for the light only you can give. Let's keep telling those stories. Let's keep remembering. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey. If this story moved you, reminded you of someone you love, or made you pause and reflect, we'd be honored if you'd help us share it. Please like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories, where every quiet voice finds a place to be heard. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter.